SantaCruzSentinel.com.
Hello, and welcome to the Reporter's Notebook podcast presented by the Santa Cruz Sentinel. I'm your host, Anthony Solis, and today we are discussing Live Oak, where it is, what the boundaries are, and why it's actually important. I'm going to talk to a few people who live in Live Oak, as well as historian Frank Perry from the Capitola History Museum. A little history on this. This came up due to an unfortunate incident in what we called Live Oak at the newspaper here, at the Emerald Bay Apartments on Soquel. A murder happened. We placed it in Live Oak, and naturally there were people who live in Live Oak who were a little upset about that. Now, this happened north of Highway 1, whereas Live Oak, to many residents, is south of Highway 1 and is not included, doesn't include the northern area. What we go by here at the newspaper, or at least what we try to go by as much as we can, are census-designated places. This gives us an actual definitive boundary of where certain communities are. That's not always perfect, as we'll discuss today. But first, I wanted to let you know what, according to the government anyway, what a census-designated place is. The CDPs are the statistical counterparts of incorporated places and are delineated to provide data for settled concentrations of population that are identifiable by name but are not legally incorporated under the laws of the state in which they are located. The boundaries usually are defined in cooperation with local or tribal officials and generally updated prior to each decennial census. These boundaries, which usually coincide with visible features or the boundary of an adjacent incorporated place or another legal entity boundary, have no legal status, nor do these places have officials elected to serve traditional municipal functions. CDP boundaries may change from one decennial census to the next with changes in the settlement pattern. A CDP with the same name as in an earlier census does not necessarily have the same boundary. CDPs must be contained within a single state and may not extend into an incorporated place. There are no population size requirements for CDPs. If you'd like to see the census designated place map that I am going off of, I've included a link to it in the description here. So why don't you look for that, and you can follow along with what we are talking about, and you'll see that according to the census, Live Oak is between Santa Cruz and Capitola to the east and west, goes all the way up, including Santa Cruz Gardens to the north, and only down as far as the railroad tracks to the south. It does not go all the way down to the ocean. That would be Twin Lakes on the western side and Pleasure Point on the eastern side. Opal Cliffs used to be a census-designated place, but it's now been incorporated into Pleasure Point. Neither of those are part of Capitola, even though in many cases people consider parts of that to be Capitola. So it can be very confusing, and I ran into this issue first a number of years ago when we were getting new reporters in and they weren't from the area, and I wanted to create a map that showed everyone, or showed the new reporters, where the neighborhoods were, so they could easily go look and see where the west side is, see where the east side is, the Hook, and all the places that we kind of take for granted, those of us who've been here for a while. I made this map public because I was wanting reader input, and that might have been a mistake. I was enemy number one for a while because some people's definitions of their neighborhood were different than other people's, and I had some problems with that. So I kind of abandoned that, and I will include a link to that map. It still exists, so you can see my failed attempt. A very rudimentary attempt at the neighborhood map. But for now, I'm going with the census-designated place. And I'd like to talk to some residents about why this is important. First up, I've got Ryan Hoffman. Now, Ryan, you live in Live Oak. How long have you lived there?
Hi there. So, I moved to Santa Cruz and immediately settled into Live Oak. I've been here since 2007. I kind of joke I got here as quick as I could.
And so you emailed me to let me know that you know exactly where the Live Oak borders are.
Yeah, I know exactly where they are.
All right, perfect. Let me know.
Yeah. As far as, King's Paint and Paper would say, it's conveniently located between Canada and Mexico. But more specifically, Live Oak enjoys kind of the optimal midpoint between downtown Santa Cruz and Capitola. I kind of consider east of 7th Avenue to a little bit west of 41st, south to the ocean, and north to Highway 1. That is the Live Oak that I know.
Okay, so you do not include the area north of Highway 1 as part of Live Oak?
No, clearly not. No, there's a natural, well, maybe man-made boundary there, but we take most of the east side.
Right, and man-made, being the highway, but that was there in I think it came in 1948. But Live Oak has been called Live Oak since this was Mexico. So, what would you call that north of Highway 1?
That is a good question.
That's the heart of what we're trying to get to right now.
Yeah, it's a tricky thing. I might remain nameless. I know that's been kind of a trend within this town, is to try and figure out where people are. There's Midtown that's kind of hopping up, and there's little microclimates and small little pockets of areas. Seabright, and whether that's distinct from Midtown, that's a debate for another day. Yeah. Right.
So I sent you a link, and I'm not sure if you had a chance to take a look at this map, but it was the census designated place, which is what Live Oak technically is right now. Being that it's just a place that the government uses to locate you when they take the census, because it is in an unincorporated area of Santa Cruz County, stuck between the city limits of Santa Cruz and the city limits of Capitola. Now, they have it, Live Oak, not going down to the ocean, which actually kind of surprised me.
I saw that, and I take some exception to that, because to me, Live Oak does include those areas which on that map were noted as Pleasure Point and Twin Lakes. To me, those are inclusive of Live Oak.
Now, some people in Pleasure Point might take exception to that. They think that they have their own identity as Pleasure Point and are not included in Live Oak. The Twin Lakes I was pretty surprised about. The Pleasure Point I wasn't quite so much.
Yeah, and I know there's been some efforts at that too, and I think that's fine. I know the Pleasure Point business community has been very active and doing some good things on 41st and along East Cliff there. To me, it's still Live Oak. It's still the east side, and it's one of the things I really like about it. The Live Oak area is a tremendous mixing pot. There's homes with $1 million value with ocean views, and there's also some high-density complexes and everything in between. So Live Oak to me is a combination of all the good things.
You keep mentioning Live Oak as part of the east side. Now, I'm going to really rock your world here. I have always known that the east side is referring to the actual city of Santa Cruz. One side, the west side, being on the western side of San Lorenzo River, and the eastern side being on the eastern side of San Lorenzo River. But it is separate from Live Oak. I'm guessing you disagree with that.
Yeah, and I'm not a surfer, so I don't want to get too much into the
right. Surfing is kind of the heart of this as well.
Yeah. I know there's the west side breaks to include the lane and other places that I don't venture into, and then over on the east side, I've heard it called such as the Hook and 38th and Pleasure Point. So I think usually west side east side comes down to a surfing debate in my book, which is also why I consider those east side beaches and surf spots to be part of Live Oak, distinct from the west side.
You mentioned Midtown as well, and I think it was a couple of years ago, we did a story on the resurgence of the Midtown, Santa Cruz, and some of the businesses that are going on there, except that a lot of people didn't know the name Midtown because, if you're looking at a map, some people considered that the east side. The Midtown is kind of a new moniker for that area, and people are taking exception, going, well, it's on the eastern side of Santa Cruz, so how is that the middle? How's that in the middle of the town? Right.
But,
people are including Live Oak.
Yeah.
So this is all very confusing.
It could be. I think for somebody that lives here, it doesn't matter a whole lot. I think we can just take pride in what we have and know that there are fun pockets to our town that are spread throughout. I think it kind of dilutes things a little bit to have too much of a localism. I think these are just neat areas of Santa Cruz that have some distinction, but to me, Live Oak just includes a nice big swath of beaches, parks. We've got the great library. We've got the farmers market. That's all Live Oak to me.
So you're very, very proud of being a resident of Live Oak.
I am. Been here since 2007. Been a homeowner since 2008, and I've enjoyed seeing what's coming up, what's happening in the area, and I like seeing people that are taking pride in it. The schools. It seems like there's some good momentum, some good things happening. So I'm excited for the future of Live Oak too.
I'm going to go out on a limb here and assume something. Your mailing address actually says Santa Cruz.
That is true.
Do you take exception to that? Does that bother you at all, being somebody who is proud of being from Live Oak?
I think being proud of my particular neighborhood, what we enjoy within Live Oak, I think it's pride in being in Santa Cruz in general, but Live Oak specifically. So I don't see any downside to being proud of both. I really do enjoy my unique area. I've got great neighbors. It's been an awesome place to live and to raise a family. So I am particularly proud of Live Oak, but in general, pretty happy Santa Cruz resident.
This discussion has come about because I don't know if you're aware, there was a murder at an apartment complex north of Highway 1, but not in the area known as Santa Cruz Gardens, which is going up Thurber Lane up to the hills up top there. And that does have its own neighborhood designation, Santa Cruz Gardens, similar to what we would say the West Side, where, not a general or not an actual border, but it's a general neighborhood. But this apartment building is in no man's land if you end Live Oak at the highway. So and it's not the city of Santa Cruz. So we kind of ran into a moment of like, wait, what do we call this? We called it Live Oak because as Supervisor Leopold told us over email, it's technically Live Oak,
right?
Whether you agree or not. So I'm jokingly, anyway, this is nothing official, but jokingly, I mentioned to our editor, Kara Myberg-Guzman, that maybe we as the newspaper should come up with a name for the area north of Highway 1. And I want to run this past you. Upper Live Oak.
Ooh, Upper Live Oak. I think geographically that is correct. It'd be nice to see some kind of uniqueness that came to that name too. I feel like Live Oak is a distinct little pocket. Maybe we can do better. I don't want me to put you guys down, but
oh no, we're just having fun here.
Yeah, I think maybe some more brainstorming is in order.
Okay.
I do know that area well. I work at the Sutter Maternity and Surgery Center just down the street from where that unfortunate incident occurred. So I'm not sure what you call it, but what it represents and the trend of what's going on in this town with public health and public safety, it is concerning. So I think regardless of where we call it, it's something that we need to address.
And it's definitely an important neighborhood because there are 2 hospitals right there.
Yeah.
Neither of the hospitals are in the city of Santa Cruz. So,
right.
Having maybe it's Hospital Way, maybe it's just calling it the Soquel Corridor. We're brainstorming, but just to give you an idea, this is the kind of argument or at least heated discussion we have here in the newsroom. It's Live Oak. No, it's not. What would you call it then? And, we want to figure out what, we want to be accurate, but we don't want to be disrespectful either. So when we're trying to name a place or pinpoint a place, we need to let people know where it is. But, maybe some people don't consider that Live Oak. So we're in kind of a bind no matter what we do.
Well, and you mentioned corridor, another hot debate in this town is the rail trail. And
yes.
So I think people are looking at corridors and transportation and how do we move from one area to the other. I think people are paying very close attention to that.
Yes. Well, hey, Ryan, thanks for your time. And thanks for taking some time out of your busy day. I know that you're pretty busy over there at Sutter. So I was very appreciative to hear what you had to say about Live Oak, and kind of, eye-opening to me as somebody who's actually a Santa Cruz resident. I didn't know where the borders of Live Oak were.
Yeah, and I think it used to be simpler. 7th Avenue over to 41st, south to the ocean, north to the highway. That to me encompasses Live Oak pretty clearly. But it was eye-opening to me to see the map and see Pleasure Point and Twin Lakes as distinct little pockets themselves.
Yeah, Opal Cliffs used to be its own census-designated place, but now it has been incorporated into Pleasure Point.
Uh-huh.
So it's constantly changing, from what I understand. I've been doing a little bit of research on this. There's a separate zip code up north of Highway 1 than there is south of Highway 1, so that has a lot to do with it. School districts have a little bit to do with it, but those are kind of split right down in the middle of communities and cities, so that might not be the best to go with. So years ago, I tried to make a neighborhood map on Google so that when new reporters came in who weren't familiar with the area, we could kind of pinpoint, hey, this is the west side, this is Live Oak, or whatever, this is the east side. And I made it public because I wanted to have input. I have never made so many enemies in my life. I upset everyone.
Right. Just trying to find your whereabouts here. And I think the real important thing, too, is no matter what we call it, the issue you brought to that, the issue that brought all this to the attention is the unfortunate murder. And I really think like public health and safety is an issue that the town is struggling with, no matter where it is. This local area where I am at Sutter right now has seen some troubles. What do we do when people get discharged from the hospital? What do we do with violent crimes? So definitely one thing there with public health and safety, and the other is, as we talked about, the rail trail. How do we move about from one area to another? These are big topics that the community is struggling with, I think. So I appreciate you shining the light on it and getting the discussion going. And from my perspective, I love living in Live Oak, and it's been a great place, and that's what I wanted to share with you and the people that read your stories, is that Live Oak is a great place to be and a great place to raise a family.
I'd like to bring in Mariah Roberts, director of the Chanticleer Park Neighbors Vecinos and a Live Oak resident. Mariah, thank you for joining me here.
Thank you so much for having me.
So really quick, I'm asking everybody this. What's your definition of Live Oak? Where do you think the borders are?
Live Oak is one of those places that needs to have that question asked. It depends on whether you're talking about the border of a supervisorial district or the school district, or whether you're looking at the census. But I think in terms of self-identity, folks that live in Live Oak tend to identify it as the highway down to the beach.
And it's in between Santa Cruz and Capitola.
Exactly. It's basically in between 7th and 41st.
7th and 41st. Okay.
More or less. Yeah.
More or less, right. A couple little going ins and outs around there.
Yeah, exactly.
Capitola has some weird borders. Why is it important to know exactly where the borders of Live Oak are, and really where Capitola and Santa Cruz end?
I think it's a conversation that comes up sort of cyclically. As somebody who's been in the area for 15, 16 years now, it's one of those things that on a daily basis, it really doesn't come up, right? The borders are not obvious. You drive over to Capitola perhaps to go to the beach, and you drive some kids down to a class in Santa Cruz. When it comes up is when you're talking about things like services, you're talking about things like representation in government, you're talking about some of the sort of systemic needs of the community and how do you serve those needs. And so that's when it comes up for me personally. And I think that just having the discussion is always a good thing. I think people are surprised sometimes, both people who live in Santa Cruz and maybe newer folks living even in the Live Oak area, that despite their address being Santa Cruz, California, 95062, they are not part of the city. They don't reap any of the benefits of being part of the city, and in fact, have fewer sort of those benefits that come with having organized services and government and infrastructure.
Right. They might be shocked to know that they don't get to vote for the city council, for example, but the confusion does continue on because they are on Santa Cruz City Water. Am I right?
That is correct. And that's another whole conversation. I'm sure you'll find other folks to talk to who have a lot of really strong feelings about that. But yeah, it's city water, and there's less representation, obviously, in terms of how people can affect decisions in city water. But yes, our water is Santa Cruz City. Yeah, exactly. So it gets very confusing, I think, and really, as a resident, you have to look way back to sort of things that have happened both by choice in terms of different areas that were incorporated or brought into the incorporated areas, and also by default. The Live Oak area until only 50 years ago or so was extremely agricultural. It was chicken farms, and it was huge swaths of agricultural bulbs and many other farmland and family plots. And it's only sort of changed because of the demand. But that really is the history of Live Oak, and it wasn't planned out to be an urban area. It sort of happened because of the need for housing.
Right, and there are still areas of Live Oak where the lots for a single-family home are much larger than you would typically get in Santa Cruz or even any other city, because it was arranged in such a way that people did have, like you said, chicken farms and stuff. So now that's one of the appeals, I would think, of Live Oak is you have a little bit of more, you got some more space to yourself.
I think so. I mean, I think it's definitely, at this point, a very densely populated area, but absolutely. I mean, there's ups and downs to that, and I don't want to get too far into my, my geeky love of urban planning, but basically, the upside is that, yes, there are plots of land that have a lot more space because they were laid out and distributed as individual chicken farms historically. The downside is that what you end up with when that plot of land gets developed, what you end up with is a small cul-de-sac of a few homes without any connection through to the rest of the community. So you have a lot of sort of segmentation in terms of what is walkable in Live Oak, if that makes sense.
Yes, absolutely.
And so you have these big divides of the larger thoroughfares like Chanticleer and 17th and 7th, and very few opportunities like you would, for example, in the city of Santa Cruz, and in most cities that have had a thoughtful layout planned in terms of how it's going to develop for people, right, to move around. And so you don't have that kind of walkability in big swaths of Live Oak. There have been movements over the years to add those in different places, but yeah, it's very unique because of that. It's part of the charm. There's a huge mansion next to a housing set of smaller homes or what have you. There's a lot of diversity in how the land has been developed.
It's very eclectic, would be a good word.
Eclectic, that is the word, yes, exactly. And I have to tell you, sometimes these conversations come up because there is no clear definition. We're not a city. Sometimes people in Live Oak will say things like, there's no there, right?
Right.
Where's the center? But for folks that have lived there and have worked really, really hard to create the connections between nonprofits and service providers and government agencies, we have to do it without the benefit of having an incorporated system, right? So people feel very, very passionately, I think, who've been involved in the community about telling our story, because the story sometimes just gets passed over. And so the fact that you're asking the questions is very appreciated, and I think always is a ripe and interesting topic.
One final thing that just struck me, and I'd like to ask you, and this is not anything that's ever come up, but I'm just curious. would you be open to being incorporated into part of Santa Cruz, or does Live Oak need to remain its own separate place?
I would be such the wrong person to answer that question. I have my own personal opinions about whether incorporation, what that brings. I think there's so much history there. And when I go back to the folks who I learned the history from, because I didn't grow up in Live Oak, my family is not originally from Live Oak, so for myself, I've had to learn these things as a parent, as a resident and a homeowner, but there have been efforts over the last century to do just that. And originally, in fact, the reason that you have 7th and 8th and all the way up to 41st is that originally Live Oak was actually intended as an annex to the city of Santa Cruz. And, of course, an area that's purely residential doesn't bring a whole lot of benefit to a city's bottom line. It does bring a lot of cost, and there are many, many reasons why that didn't happen. But I think that's a whole other podcast, and I think that personally, just as an individual, I personally would love to see Live Oak as part of the city of Santa Cruz. But you'll talk to a ton of people in Live Oak who have strong feelings in other ways. So,
Mariah, thank you for joining us here on the podcast. And maybe when we revisit this, maybe annexing issue, I'll give you another call.
Thanks so much.
Joining me now is Kate Hennenkamp. She's a trustee for the Live Oak School Board. Kate, welcome. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you.
So you sit on the Live Oak School Board, and we were talking about the borders of Live Oak and where exactly Live Oak falls. So right off the bat, where do you think Live Oak is?
Well, I know that for different purposes, different definitions are used. I tend to think of it kind of as like from the harbor to 41st Avenue and from the freeway to the ocean, that little square. But I know there's like the census designated place, which is a little bit different. And then there's the issue of zip codes, which is completely unhelpful because, of course, the 95062 is partly Eastside Santa Cruz, and then some people in the 95065 think of themselves as being part of Live Oak. But, yeah, I tend to think of from the freeway south.
From the freeway south, freeway to the ocean. Now, what about Pleasure Point and Twin Lakes? Would you consider those neighborhoods in Live Oak, or are they kind of separate from Live Oak?
I think of them as neighborhoods in Live Oak. I mean, I guess I sort of defer to the school district boundaries, which include those areas.
Right. The school district, it includes all of Twin Lakes. It includes all of your definition of Live Oak, with the exception of Opal Cliffs, which is now, it used to be a census designated place. It is now part of Pleasure Point, south of Capitola. That's part of the Soquel School District.
Okay.
And so, yeah, and if I'm reading my maps correctly, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but the Live Oak Elementary School District goes into Capitola and includes the area of the Capitola Mall, which is technically in the Capitola school city limit.
Well, I don't know anyone who lives at the mall, so that hasn't really come up as an issue, but okay. I know that area just south of Capitola Road. I know some school district families live in that neighborhood, which I think you're right, is Capitola.
Why is it important that we get the borders of Live Oak right?
Well, I guess it, of course, depends who you ask. I mean, at some point there are resources that might be involved, depending on how the census describes the neighborhood. If it has, certain needs, then maybe programs could be eligible for certain funding and that kind of thing. But it seems like what people get the most passionate about is sort of about the identity. And I'm sure you know that Live Oak, however you define it, I think it's the third largest population in the county. If it were a city, it would be bigger than Capitola. It would be bigger than Scotts Valley. So even though it's not a city, it's got a lot of people. And so a lot of people identify with Live Oak as as their neighborhood. And so I think that becomes important to people. Where we live is a part of who we are.
Live Oak residents in particular in this county seem to really identify with Live Oak more than any other place. And something that I've brought up, I have a couple friends who live in Live Oak and they really love it, but there's a sore point for them that their address says Santa Cruz.
Mm-hmm.
And, I've brought this up with a few other residents and some who will be on this same podcast, that might cause a little bit of confusion or make people maybe even thump their chest about Live Oak a little bit more, because they're dealing with the zip code issue that has to put their city as Santa Cruz as opposed to Live Oak, which there actually already is a Live Oak, California,
right.
up north. So we will never have a Live Oak here that's an actual city, no matter what. Right.
We'd have to pick a different name, I guess.
Which would cause a lot more problems.
It would, I'm sure. Well, and there are all sorts of complications that arise. The work I do is in community-based organizations, nonprofit organizations, and we a lot of times get funding from the city of Santa Cruz, and the city of Santa Cruz wants us to report back on who we assisted that live within the city limits, who are their residents, and it's very hard to identify people. I mean, ultimately, what you have to do is ask people for their address and look it up on a map, because there's a lot of people who live in Live Oak who think they live in the city of Santa Cruz.
Yes.
Yeah, so that gets confusing. And then I guess I'm a big proponent of democratic participation, and it's frustrating for me when people, they kind of are not aware, that the Santa Cruz City Council doesn't represent us if we're living in Live Oak, and people kind of think, oh yeah, we're that's our government, or that somehow they can have some sort of influence. When of course they can't. If you're voting in Live Oak, you can choose a school board, you can choose a county supervisor, and I guess the at-large positions on the Santa Cruz City School District. But that's about it, other than countywide offices.
Yeah, I do think that there are a number of people who don't know that that's Live Oak, or that it's not Santa Cruz. And part of this, just my thought, is the confusion over East Side Santa Cruz. Now, do you consider Live Oak East Side Santa Cruz or the East Side?
No, I would not.
You would not? Okay.
I've lived in East Side Santa Cruz, but yeah, no, it's different. It's a different vibe, and yeah, I mean, it's not the east side of Santa Cruz. It's not Santa Cruz at all. And I know there's signs. I was actually just talking to somebody in my office today about this, and that as you're going up SoCal Drive, SoCal Avenue, I guess, past the Palo Alto Medical Foundation, there's a "Welcome to Santa Cruz" sign right there. So those of us who pay attention to such things would think, well, if I'm entering Santa Cruz right now, where was I before? And I think there might be a sign like that along the train tracks as you're coming in past the harbor, but I'm not 100% sure of that. But yeah, other than those two little signs, you wouldn't. There's no demarcation.
Right. Now, you mentioned the train tracks, and the census designated map that I'm going off of has Live Oak ending to the south at those train tracks. And so south of that on the west side would be Twin Lakes, and on the east side would be Pleasure Point. Mm-hmm. So it goes down to the actual train tracks, which I found interesting. I'd never thought of that as a separation. And we don't have to go by us at the newspaper when we're placing things. We don't really have to go by the census designated place, but it's nice to have a boundary, like something that says this is where it is, so that when we look up an address and something happens, we can properly locate it. But as we found out recently, that doesn't always work.
Right.
And so a little bit later in the podcast, I'm going to be talking to Frank Perry, who is the curator at the Capitola Historical Museum. So we're going to see what he has to say about the history of Live Oak and its historical borders, which are probably different from what they are now, considering that Highway 1 didn't used to always be there.
Right.
So the area north of Highway 1, do you know what that area is called, or do you have a suggestion for that area?
Yeah, that's actually a good question. So I know there's that Santa Cruz Gardens neighborhood, right?
Yes,
but
which is
that's
up Thurber Lane, but not down on Soquel.
Mm-hmm. So that's not Santa Cruz Gardens. I know somebody who lives in that neighborhood, and she identifies as looking in Live Oak. But I think for her, it's more a cultural thing that she feels very connected to sort of the heart of Live Oak, and so she's choosing to identify. Yeah, no, I mean, It's not SoCal, it's not Santa Cruz. Yeah, it's kind of the hospital zone there. But that is the hospital. The hospital's not in the city of Santa Cruz either, is
Nope,
it?
It is not.
No.
Which was surprising to me when I, a number of years ago, I think when I first did my first attempt at a neighborhood map and failed miserably, I was a little shocked when I found out that the border it just went right behind the hospital. I'm like, why wouldn't you include that? The city should include the hospital. They'd get a little bit more money out of that. But somebody made that choice.
Yeah, no, but that neighborhood, if it's not Live Oak, it definitely needs a name. Or North Live Oak? I don't know.
North Live Oak, yes, North Live Oak. I had considered Upper Live Oak.
Upper Live Oak.
Upper Live Oak, because we've got the Upper West Side and the West Side, so I figured it would play with that. But I'll ask.
And there are some hills there, so
I'll ask Mr. Perry about that and see what he has to say about those designations. There was a book too that in some emails with Frank Perry, in trying to get him on this podcast, he referenced a book that was published in 1986 that I do not have a copy of, unfortunately. But he said that book described, it was a book called Santa Cruz County Place Names, and which I need this book. It describes Live Oak as between the harbor, or actually between Arana Gulch and Soquel Creek, north to the foothills and south to the Monterey Bay. Now, part of that has become Capitola. This was before Capitola was a city, so it included all of that area. Now Capitola has sort of creeped into some of that, but that's the historic definition of Live Oak, and I'll hopefully ask him a little bit more about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, that makes sense. Like you say, that the freeway is new. So if the freeway weren't there, I mean, literally, there's streets like in the neighborhood where I live, Chanticleer. The freeway cuts right through. So if you're looking for an address on Chanticleer, you have to figure out, is it north of the freeway or south of the freeway? And that's
talking with my wife the other day. I kind of thought that might be why some of this debate comes up, is that it feels so completely separate because it's not easy to get from one side to the other. It doesn't feel like one community, one neighborhood. It's a community divided in many ways.
Right.
So you told me earlier that you considered Live Oak to end right there at the freeway. However, talking about the map, talking about the school districts that does end at the freeway, and everything else we might have talked about right now, do you still think that, or do you think we could get away with, or could include Live Oak going all the way up to the top of Thurber Lane?
Well, I mean, I'm certainly willing to embrace the people on that side of the freeway as my neighbors, but I think in terms of sort of what people envision, if you're asking if the Sentinel says that such and such happened in Live Oak, I think it would be nice to have some sort of a qualifier, like you said, Upper Live Oak or whatever, so that people are envisioning the area that you're talking about.
Kate Hennekamp, thank you for joining me on the podcast. It's been great talking to you.
Thank you. Likewise.
Let's get a perspective from a historian. Joining me now is Frank Perry, the Capitola Historical Museum curator. Now, Mr. Perry, what are the borders of Live Oak as you understand them to be?
Well, having grown up in the area, I've always thought of Live Oak as being between Santa Cruz and Capitola, and between Monterey Bay and the foothills.
And that comes from the Santa Cruz County Place Names book that was published around, the mid-'80s, somewhere in there?
Well, that's pretty similar to what Don Clark said in Santa Cruz County place names. Although his was even broader. He was using a historical definition, which was before there was a city of Capitola. So he went from Soquel Creek to Arana Gulch.
And you've seen the map that I sent you of the census-designated places.
Correct.
And you had kind of a funny reaction being a lifelong resident of Live Oak. What happened when you looked at that map?
Well, I see the census kind of divided Live Oak up a little bit. They separated out the Twin Lakes area and also the Pleasure Point area. And according to that, I'm in their census-designated area of Pleasure Point and not in Live Oak.
So all these years you thought you were a Live Oak resident. Turns out you're in Pleasure Point.
Well, I don't know about all these years because I don't know when the census came up with these census-designated areas. I think those are kind of new to my way of thinking.
They change all the time from what research I've been looking into, and Opal Cliffs used to be a census-designated place, and it isn't any longer. It's been incorporated into Pleasure Point. I haven't quite figured out why that is. I'm still looking into that.
Well, it would be, I'm pretty sure Opal Cliffs would be in the Soquel school district and not Live Oak, but I'm not positive of that. I mean, the whole Pleasure Point and Live Oak area is in the Live Oak school district.
Where does Live Oak come from? I mean, do you know the history of it, where it gets its name, and historically what the boundaries were?
Well, there were two ranchos that are now Live Oak, two Mexican ranchos. One was the Rancho Rodeo, and the other rancho, I forget its name in Spanish, but it meant the Rancho of the Little Live Oaks, and that was the western of the two big ranchos. It ran from Rodeo Gulch to Arana Gulch, and so that's where the name comes from the name of the one Mexican rancho, although that rancho I don't think was ever confirmed, so it doesn't appear on a lot of maps. It's kind of an unofficial Mexican rancho.
And so the name predates the Highway 1, which was 1948. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, that rancho was, I think, the 1830s, so it predates it by over a century.
Yeah, so back then, anyway, using what we consider where Highway 1 is, that there wasn't a dividing mark. There wasn't a landmark that could divide two particular communities, but now there is, and it has two distinct personalities on each side of the highway. Do you think that it might be time to, at least unofficially, maybe come up with a different name for the...
Well, I never thought about that before, but you're right. That highway really has divided things since the late 40s when it was put in. And as far as I know, that area doesn't have a name, so maybe somebody can come up with a good one.
I talked to a Live Oak resident just a little while ago who will be on this podcast, and I mentioned to him an idea that I had, because he was adamant that's not Live Oak at all. So I just said, well, how about Upper Live Oak? And he was polite. He kind of laughed a little bit, and he goes, I think you need to keep working on it.
Well, I saw a real estate ad about 5 years ago, and it described a house on my street as being in North Pleasure Point. And I'd never seen that before.
That's new.
But that's the Pleasure Point area north of Portola Drive. So
right, and
maybe North Live Oak.
Yeah, there you go. North Live Oak and regular Live Oak. Now, something else was brought up to me. Is Live Oak the east side?
Well, I've heard that there's this big controversy over where's East Side Santa Cruz, and that somebody started this whole business calling it Midtown.
Yes, we had a story a couple years ago about that.
Right. So I don't like that term much because, growing up, it was always East Side Santa Cruz. There was East Side Hardware, and everything was called East Side there. The only Midtown I ever heard of was the Midtown Market in SoCal.
Right, not exactly Santa Cruz over there.
No. Well, part of this confusion, and I've just been talking with a woman who's been doing some research on the history of Live Oak, is that the plan was for a long time back in the 1960s for Santa Cruz city limits to take over Live Oak. And that's why Live Oak has the same zip code as eastern part of Santa Cruz, 95062. And the post office couldn't have a separate Live Oak post office because there's already a town of Live Oak in California.
Yeah, Northern California, there's Live Oak.
Yeah. So as this researcher was telling me, there are people who move to Live Oak and, they have 95062, and then they get their ballot in the mail when it comes time to vote, and they wonder why they're not voting for Santa Cruz City Council candidates.
Right. I mean, it took a few years of me living in town before I realized that the city limit ended at the harbor. And I just kind of naturally assumed, first of all, I sort of assumed it went at least to 7th Avenue or beyond, but it's actually a few blocks west of 7th Avenue where the dividing line is. And I think there are a number of people who move over there because their address is Santa Cruz still that didn't know that they weren't in the city limits of Santa Cruz.
Yeah, it's 95062 and the address is Santa Cruz. So it is confusing.
Yeah, it's it's incredibly confusing for us here at the newspaper. We want to make sure that we are locating things specifically. And if we call an area like the Emerald Bay Apartments Live Oak, there are people who are like, wait a second, that's not Live Oak. That's not, you're not saying where it is accurately. And it's not Santa Cruz either. So we're kind of in this weird, we're kind of stuck. If it doesn't have a name, what do you call it?
Well, I've another thing that's kind of confusing. I have friends who live in Bonnie Doon, and technically their address is Santa Cruz. Yes,
because it is the same zip code.
Some of them will put, Bonnie Doon, California, and the zip code. And so I never know, should I put, Bonnie Doon, parenthesis, Santa Cruz, or... It's a little confusing.
Yeah, it is. And I've been researching, finding out that Live Oak, north of Highway 1, has a separate zip code, which adds to a little bit of the confusion. Maybe that's part of its separate identity, but I didn't realize how far up north 95060 went. And it does include Bonnie Doon. And they said that some of the articles I were reading said that in the zip code, the post office typically wants one city or one name listed. So everything within the zip code will fall under the same name. And there are instances across the country where a zip code dips into another city limit and either name is acceptable as long as the zip code is correct.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. So, and that just really got me thinking about some of the areas here in town that, I've never lived in Bonnie Doon. I've never lived in Felton, but those aren't officially towns. They're just census designated places. And I've never thought about what the address to some of these places are.
Yeah, it's, we're kind of all, if you were starting from scratch and the land was completely empty and you were laying all this out, you could lay it out so that it made sense. But we're kind of all slaves to history.
Yeah, we are in more than just this instance. Mr. Perry, thank you for taking the time to talk with me, and I loved hearing about the history. And you are responsible for sending me the focal point photos that we run in the paper every Sunday. And I've told you before that is one of the highlights of my week because I'm such a nerd for history, and I love seeing some of the old Santa Cruz and Santa Cruz County views that you give me. So thank you for that.
Oh, you're welcome.
So we've heard from four residents actually, including the historian Frank Perry. Now what do we do about that here at the paper? So finally, got to bring her in again, your favorite, Sentinel Managing Editor, Kara Myberg Guzman. Thanks for joining me again.
Thanks for having me.
So we've heard from people. We've heard the arguments of where Live Oak is, and a lot of them do say that it stops at Highway 1. But from the perspective of the newspaper, what do you think? I mean, we have to label. Why is it important that we get this accurate? I guess first of all, from the newspaper's point of view.
Right. So I definitely hear from residents that, this is where the, Live Oak community believes the boundaries of where the neighborhood is. But for the newspaper, we have to go beyond, what the sort of cultural longtime beliefs are in the neighborhood. Our number one priority that we're always pointing towards is what is accurate, what is true. And so because of that mindset, we have to go by the census designated place, which tells us, the boundaries of Live Oak stretch north, past Highway 1, including the Santa Cruz Gardens and Dominican Hospital area.
I mean, it's not... I guess we could call it whatever we want. We're the newspaper. There's no legal reason why we could call it one thing or the other. But the reason why I would say that we would go by the census designated place is that there's an actual boundary that we can say this is here. Is that right? I mean,
right.
Is that kind of the main reason why it's not a fuzzy boundary?
It's accurate.
Yeah. It's accurate to the census. Whether residents may or may not agree, and we've heard from a few that don't agree with that, but until the census calls it something else, that's what we're going to go with, right?
Right.
So that kind of means then there were some suggestions. North Live Oak and Upper Live Oak were some of the suggestions. I'm guessing a no-go on those then?
No. If you do that, where does it stop? We have to hold ourselves to a consistent standard, and the census designated place is something that we can actually hang our hat on. So yeah, we're sort of sticking by the rule book on this one. I mean, we've put a lot of thought into this. We've
been talking about this in the newsroom for a few weeks now and going back and forth, whether we should or shouldn't call north of Highway 1 Live Oak.
Right. Did you explain to...
I didn't mention any names, but let's just say not everyone in the newsroom is on the same page.
Well, what started this whole thing was the shooting at the Emerald Bay Apartments, and we in our first story on that, I think we called it Santa Cruz. I can't remember the timeline, but there was, a setting it straight correction involved. We weren't consistent with our first two or three stories on that, and finally we just had to as a team step back and figure out what the heck are we calling this place, which prompted actually this whole podcast and all of
right.
your sleuthing.
It got me really curious. I've always been curious about neighborhoods in Santa Cruz and the census designated places and maps. I mean, that's kind of my MO here, and I don't like not knowing where some place is. And so, I found things fascinating. I've never lived in Live Oak. I've never lived in an unincorporated area. I've always lived within a city limit. So it's not anything I've ever really thought about as far as what my address is and what I'm called and where I live and the identity of that. So I found it very fascinating, and I'm glad I've talked to people and did this. And I thought it was very enlightening to me. I hope it's enlightening to other listeners as well. But what it comes down to is we're going by the boundary, and that's the census designated place boundary, and it's considered Live Oak up there. We don't use the west side as a date line, So, we're not going to use separate neighborhoods in there, but this opens up a little bit of a Pandora's box, and we're going to have to be on our toes because Twin Lakes and Pleasure Point are separate census designated areas, and we're going to have to, if we're going to call Live Oak, we're going to call those places by their names as well. So it'll take a little bit of a, we're just going to have to be on the ball, and people are going to call us out for that, and they should. That's how we know that there's a controversy or an issue that we can address if they do call us out. I kind of welcome that. Do you?
Please email, call us, let us know. Otherwise, we are just yelling it into an empty box. Exactly.
Well, Kara, thanks for joining me. I want to thank all of my guests, Frank Perry, Mariah Roberts, Ryan Hoffman, and Kate Hennenkamp, and of course, Kara Myberg-Guzman. Thanks for joining me. You can subscribe to the Reporter's Notebook on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher. You can listen to us on iHeartRadio and coming soon on Spotify as well. Thank you for listening.